I thought I knew her. I thought we were invincible. But I was wrong. What happens when the person you trust the most shatters everything? John Sullivan's heart races as he sits in front of his laptop, the screen casting a cold light on his face. The world outside the office window is quiet, but inside, his life is unraveling. He clicks open the email from the private investigator, his hands trembling. The images that load on the screen hit him like a punch to the gut. His wife, April, the woman he has supported for years, locked in an intimate embrace with Doug Simpson, a powerful political figure and ally. The images are crystal clear. There's no denying it. His mind spins in disbelief. "I thought I knew her," John whispers, the words heavy with pain. The camera zooms in on his face as a wave of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak washes over him. This wasn't just a passing affair, it was a deep, emotional betrayal. The love he once had for April, his partner in both marriage and politics, now feels like a distant memory, lost in a world of lies and deception. His eyes dart to the corner of the room where his wedding photo once sat proudly. He can't look at it anymore. It's a symbol of everything that's been destroyed. The video shifts to a quick flashback, a scene from happier times. John and April, together on the campaign trail, smiling, laughing, the perfect political couple. But the montage fades into a stark reality. John sitting alone in the office, clutching divorce papers. The camera pans out as he walks out of the office, leaving behind the life he once knew. His voiceover breaks the silence. This is the story of a man who thought he had it all, until betrayal tore everything apart. The final shot shows John in his car, speeding down the highway, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. His thoughts swirl in the chaos of the moment, but he knows one thing for sure. His world is never going to be the same again. John Sullivan is the kind of man who once thrived in the shadows of powerful political figures, quietly guiding his wife's rise to power with sharp strategy and even sharper instincts. At 42, he's always been the stoic, steady hand behind April's political career. A former campaign manager turned consultant, well-respected but never in the spotlight. Their partnership seemed unbreakable. Together, they were an unstoppable force, a power couple destined for greatness. But as the years pass, John starts to feel like a shadow in his own life. The sparkle in April's eyes that once made him feel seen now flickers with an intensity he can't quite reach. She's always busy, too busy. Late nights at the office, endless campaign meetings, and constant phone calls from political allies. John doesn't mind the hard work. He's always been her biggest supporter. But something is changing. The woman who once sought his opinion, who would smile at him across the dinner table, now barely looks up when he enters the room. The connection they shared is slipping away, piece by piece. The cracks in their marriage grow wider with each passing day. John tries to fill the void with work, distracting himself with his own projects, his own clients. But there's no escaping the truth that his wife's heart is no longer where it used to be. The late-night phone calls, the whispered conversations, and the increasing distance between them are impossible to ignore. Yet he remains hopeful. Maybe it's just the pressure of the campaign, he tells himself. Maybe once it's over, they'll reconnect. But deep down, John knows something is off. He begins to notice the subtle changes in April, how she's become more distant, more guarded. He feels like an outsider in his own marriage. For John, the reality is too painful to face. He's the man who has always believed in his marriage, in his wife's love. But the signs are undeniable. Is this the beginning of the end? Can a marriage built on political ambition survive the weight of emotional distance? John's mind races as he contemplates the future, uncertain if the woman he loves is still the same person he married. The fundraiser was meant to be just another political event, an evening of speeches, donations, and handshakes, where April would charm her wealthy donors with her smile and articulate vision for the future. John had attended these events countless times, standing by her side, offering his quiet support. But tonight, as he stood in the background, something felt different. John moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces when a conversation between two men caught his attention. Their words hit him like a cold splash of water. He froze, unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest. The men were discussing April, specifically her rumored affair with someone high in the political ranks. John's ears burned with the details they spoke so casually about, as if they had been gossiping about someone else. The whispers were full of speculation. But there was one name that made his stomach twist: Doug Simpson, a key player in the political party who had been a close ally to April. The conversation drifted into another topic, but John couldn't stop replaying what he had just heard. He had always trusted April. She had worked so hard to build her career, and he had been right there beside her, every step of the way. Could this really be true? He had seen Doug and April interact at previous events, and although their connection had always seemed professional, a nagging thought began to grow inside him. John tried to shake off the suspicions, telling himself it was just gossip, nothing more. But as the night wore on, he couldn't let go of what he'd overheard. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. The evening's event ended with April giving a speech, surrounded by reporters and donors, but all John could focus on was the pit in his stomach. Later that night, in the quiet of their home, John tried to confront April subtly, asking her about her relationship with Doug. April's dismissive response only deepened his worries. She brushed off the question, offering a forced smile and a promise to talk later when they had more time. The coldness in her tone stung. There was something off, something John couldn't quite put his finger on, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that the first crack in their marriage had just appeared. He had to know more. The moment John saw them together, everything in his life shifted. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was undeniable, heart-shattering truth. The fundraiser had been a turning point, but now there was no turning back. It was the day of a big event, one of those gala-style evenings where political figures from all over the city gathered. April was once again the center of attention, surrounded by admirers and donors. John, ever the supportive husband, was lingering in the background, watching as April handled her public persona with grace. But this time, he wasn't just watching her from the sidelines, he was actively searching for answers. John had taken it upon himself to do some sleuthing. He knew April had been busy, but tonight, there was something off. As the evening stretched on, John found himself wandering the backstage area, slipping through the hidden corridors of the event hall. He wasn't expecting to find anything. He was just looking for a moment of quiet when everything around him felt like a whirlwind of lies. But then he heard voices. He recognized them immediately: Doug Simpson's low, commanding voice, followed by April's unmistakable laugh. At first, he thought it was just a casual conversation, maybe some last-minute campaign talk. But when he rounded the corner, the sight before him struck him like a bolt of lightning. April was standing in Doug's arms, her back pressed against him as he whispered something in her ear. Their chemistry was undeniable, their closeness too intimate to be anything but what it was: an affair. Doug's hand was resting on April's waist, his lips brushing against her neck, and April, for the first time in John's presence, wasn't pulling away. Instead, she leaned into him, as if the connection was all too familiar, all too comfortable. John's heart sank, the air in his lungs vanishing as he stood frozen, watching the betrayal unfold before him. His eyes locked on them, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. All the love he had once felt for April, all the years of standing by her side, felt like they were slipping through his fingers like sand. The realization was crushing, and in that moment, he knew. This was the end. As he stood there, fighting back tears, a surge of anger coursed through him. The anger wasn't just for the affair. It was for everything. For the years he had supported her, for the marriage he had built with someone who now seemed so different, so distant. April, his wife, had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now there was no turning back. John turned and left the venue without a word to anyone, the weight of what he had just seen pressing down on him with every step. But he knew one thing for certain. He needed answers. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more proof, more evidence. The truth was too much to process all at once. But he would find a way to expose this, no matter the cost. John's heart continued to race as he grappled with the reality of what he had witnessed. He couldn't shake the image of April and Doug together. It burned in his mind, replaying over and over like a sickening loop. But that wasn't enough. He needed to know more. He needed concrete proof, undeniable evidence, not just his suspicions. What he had seen wasn't a fluke. It was the beginning of an unraveling, and John was determined to expose the truth. The following day, unable to focus on anything else, John immersed himself in research. His mind raced with questions. How long had this affair been going on? Was Doug the only one? Or were there more men? As he scrolled through his news feed, John stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. A series of blog posts written by local political bloggers discussing rumors of April's alleged affairs. The posts didn't just speculate, they painted a disturbing picture of a woman who had allegedly traded sexual favors for political endorsements. One blog post detailed a list of prominent political figures and businessmen who had supposedly been involved with April. As John read the words, disbelief mixed with anger. The accusations were shocking, and yet they seemed all too plausible given what he had witnessed backstage with Doug. Could it be true? Had April been using her body to climb higher in the political ranks? The thought of it made him sick to his stomach. But as much as John wanted to dismiss it all as baseless gossip, the pieces were starting to fall into place. These weren't just random rumors. The bloggers had sources, people who claimed to have witnessed April's interactions with multiple men. There were even mentions of secretive meetings and private rendezvous, all masked under the guise of political negotiations and endorsements. John felt a surge of determination. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He needed to confront April, to force her to come clean. But before he could do that, he had to ensure he had everything, every shred of evidence. He contacted the bloggers, hoping to get more information, to connect the dots between the rumors and the reality of what had been going on behind closed doors. The bloggers were surprisingly forthcoming, sharing confidential details and even offering to provide him with the names of others who might be able to confirm the accusations. They warned him, however, that this could ruin not only April's career, but also their entire family's reputation. The risks were monumental. But for John, the truth had to come out. He had to know everything. There would be no hiding anymore. Just as John was beginning to piece everything together, the final piece of the puzzle arrived in his inbox. It was a video, a damning recording of April with Doug Simpson. The video was raw, unfiltered, and painful to watch. It showed them in a hotel room, not just talking but entwined in an intimate embrace, their bodies pressed together as Doug kissed her deeply. It was clear that they were more than just business associates, more than just two people involved in a political negotiation. John sat in stunned silence as the video played on his screen. The room around him seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of his emotions. This wasn't just hearsay anymore. This wasn't just an overheard conversation or a series of rumors. It was real. He could see it with his own eyes. April, his wife, had been sleeping with Doug, and from the looks of it, this wasn't a one-time fling. The intimacy between them was genuine, unguarded, and far too comfortable for someone who was supposedly faithful. His mind raced as he tried to process everything. All the signs were there now. The distance between them, the late nights, the whispers of infidelity. But seeing it all laid out in front of him like this was gut-wrenching. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. John knew now that his marriage was a lie. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had stood by through every political battle, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Tears welled up in John's eyes, but he fought them back. He wasn't going to let April see him break. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. No, he had to be stronger than ever before. It was time to take action. He contacted his attorney immediately. They discussed the next steps: divorce proceedings, asset protection, and ensuring that he would be able to maintain custody of their children. John knew that this wouldn't be easy. Divorcing a woman who was in the public eye, especially one as politically connected as April, was going to be a battle. But he was ready. His heart was broken, yes, but it was also filled with an unshakable resolve. He was done being the shadow in his own marriage. It was time for April to face the consequences of her actions. As John hung up the phone, the weight of what he was about to do sank in. He had been blindsided by the truth, but now he would use it as his strength. He wouldn't let April's betrayal destroy him any longer. He was going to fight back. John was living in a state of emotional turmoil. The truth about April's affair, and the shocking reality that his entire marriage had been a lie, had shattered him. But he wasn't going to let his pain paralyze him. He knew the next step was crucial. He couldn't go into this blindly. He needed to protect himself and his future. So, he made the call. His attorney, Sarah Connors, had been his legal counsel for years, but never had he needed her services more than now. He walked into her office that morning, his heart heavy, his mind racing with questions. Sarah was a seasoned professional, and she could immediately see the weight of John's burden. She didn't need to hear the details to understand what was at stake. "John, I'm sorry you're going through this," Sarah said, her voice calm but compassionate. "But we need to think clearly about your next steps. This is going to be a battle, no matter how we approach it. April's a public figure, and this will attract attention. We need to make sure you're prepared for everything." John nodded. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. April was a powerful woman, running for re-election with a massive political following. If this affair were to become public, it could destroy her career, and possibly his as well. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let her get away with this, not after everything he had endured. They went over the details of their assets, their business interests, and most importantly, the custody arrangements for their children. John had always been a hands-on father, and he knew that his bond with his kids was one of the few things in his life that hadn't been tainted by April's deceit. Protecting them, ensuring they were shielded from the public fallout, was his top priority. Sarah also advised John on the importance of gathering every shred of evidence he could find: emails, texts, photos, anything that would strengthen his case. The more ammunition he had, the better his chances of securing a fair settlement. They also discussed the possibility of a public confrontation, though John wasn't entirely sure he was ready for that yet. "What about April's political allies?" John asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "April is connected to some very powerful people. They will fight back, and they'll use everything they can to discredit you. But you need to stand your ground. This is about your dignity, your family's future. We'll take the high road, but we'll also be prepared for anything." John left Sarah's office that day with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. The path ahead was uncertain, and the weight of his decision was heavy, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let April's betrayal define him any longer. It was time to fight back, legally, emotionally, and when the time came, publicly. John had been planning the memorial service for weeks. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't something he took lightly. But in his heart, he knew this was the moment to expose April's betrayal, to take control of the narrative, and to publicly end their marriage on his terms. This wasn't just about getting back at her, it was about his dignity. It was about ensuring that the world knew the truth about what she had done. The idea came to him when he was sitting alone one evening, watching a documentary on political scandals. There was one segment about how public figures often tried to spin their personal lives for the media. That was when it hit him. He could take control of his own story. The mock memorial service would do just that. It would be a powerful, symbolic gesture, one that would leave no room for doubt in anyone's mind. Their marriage was over. The setup was simple. John rented a small private venue that would allow for a more intimate gathering of family, friends, and a few trusted political figures. The invitees were told it was a memorial service for the death of his marriage. John knew it would be a spectacle, and he didn't mind. April was going to face the consequences of her actions, and she was going to do it in front of everyone who had ever supported her. The day of the event arrived, and John stood backstage, dressed in black, his emotions carefully concealed behind a mask of stoic determination. The service itself was going to be brief, a few words spoken about the death of their once promising marriage. But the real drama was going to unfold in the final moments. As April entered the venue, she looked radiant, unaware of what was about to happen. She had agreed to attend, thinking it would be some cathartic exercise, some way for John to move on from their troubled marriage. She had no idea what he had planned. John stepped to the podium, his voice unwavering. "Today we gather not just to remember what was," he began, his words echoing through the room, "but to lay to rest what could never be again. The marriage between April Sullivan and I has ended, not just in the eyes of the law, but in my heart." As April watched, stunned, John did the unthinkable. He opened a coffin that had been placed at the center of the room, revealing their wedding attire, his tuxedo, her wedding dress. The audience gasped as John placed the clothes inside, closing the coffin with finality. It was a public burial of their marriage, a dramatic, symbolic gesture that left no room for misinterpretation. And then, with a flourish, John did the one thing that would sever their ties for good. He served April with divorce papers in front of everyone. The room was silent, the tension palpable as the truth of what had transpired hit April like a freight train. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing she could say that could undo the damage. John watched as April's face fell, her public facade shattering before her eyes. She had hoped for a reconciliation, but instead, she faced the full force of John's hurt and anger. As she sobbed in the middle of the room, John turned and walked away, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbreakable. The mock memorial service had achieved its purpose. John had taken back his power. The world now knew the truth. The event was over, but the consequences were just beginning. As John drove away from the venue, he could feel a mix of emotions churning inside him. He was both exhausted and relieved. He had done it. He had publicly exposed April for her betrayal. He had confronted her with the truth, the painful truth that had been eating away at him for months. And now, there was no turning back. But as he drove through the city streets, the weight of it all began to settle in. The emotions that had been held at bay during the event, rage, sadness, and disappointment, began to wash over him. He had expected to feel vindicated, empowered even. But in the aftermath, the hollow echo of what had happened left him with a deep, unsettling sense of loss. April, meanwhile, was in complete devastation. Her world had crumbled in front of a crowd of people, political allies, family, and friends, all witnesses to the public shaming of her marriage. She had been caught off guard, not just by the public exposure, but by John's strength. She had assumed that he would never confront her like this. And now she was left alone, sobbing in the empty hall, her political career teetering on the edge of destruction. April had always been ambitious, always in control. But in that moment, as she sat amidst the remnants of her marriage, it was clear that she had lost everything. Her political campaign, which had once seemed like a sure thing, was now in jeopardy. The media had already begun to pounce on her infidelity, painting her as a hypocrite, a woman who had betrayed not only her husband but also the very public she had promised to serve. The betrayal had become the defining narrative of her life. And yet, amidst all of this, April still harbored a glimmer of hope. She had hoped that John would take pity on her, that he would soften, that they could somehow reconcile. But the look in John's eyes when he served her the divorce papers, the cold finality of his actions, told her everything. There would be no reconciliation. The damage was too great. She was alone now, left to face the consequences of her actions. As John sat in his car, reflecting on the aftermath, he couldn't help but wonder what his next step would be. There was no going back to the life he had known before. His marriage, his career, everything he had once held dear was now in ruins. But at least he had his integrity. He had taken control of his own narrative, and in doing so he had freed himself from the emotional prison that had held him captive for so long. John wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the man he had been when he walked into that memorial service. The public confrontation had not just marked the end of his marriage, it had marked the beginning of his journey toward healing. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest sense of hope that he could rebuild his life, piece by piece. As days turned into weeks, the full impact of John's decision continued to unfold. The media had caught on quickly to the drama surrounding his public divorce from April, and the aftermath was far-reaching. The story of their marriage's demise became a sensation, splashed across newspapers, blogs, and news outlets. While John had hoped for some sense of peace after the confrontation, what he received instead was a whirlwind of attention, some sympathetic, some critical. But it wasn't the media storm that was the hardest part. It was the quiet aftermath, the moments of solitude, the silence that stretched between John and his children as they tried to adjust to life after the collapse of the family they once knew. His kids, still young, had questions he wasn't always prepared to answer. They didn't fully understand why their mother wasn't around as much anymore, why their father seemed distant at times, or why they could no longer go to the family home they had shared. John struggled to navigate these painful conversations, to explain the unexplainable. The weight of betrayal lingered in his mind. He had built a life with April, and now it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under him. He had poured so much of himself into their relationship, believing in the dream of a shared future. But the reality of her infidelity, the lies, and the manipulation left deep scars that would take time, maybe even years, to heal. For April, the consequences were equally dire. After the public shaming, her political campaign all but imploded. She faced pressure from her party to step down, and her support base began to erode as more details of her infidelities were revealed. The scandal that John had exposed had left a permanent stain on her career, and no matter how hard she tried to salvage it, the damage was irreparable. The public's perception of her had been permanently tainted, and April's once promising future seemed to evaporate before her eyes. John had the satisfaction of knowing that he had taken the high road. He had exposed the truth, and now he was free to move forward. But freedom didn't come without its own costs. The pain of betrayal still lingered in his heart. He was no longer a husband, no longer a part of the life he had once known. But in the face of that loss, he had regained control of his own fate. Months passed, and John slowly began to rebuild his life. He spent more time with his children, focused on his work, and slowly opened himself up to the possibility of new beginnings. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they were no longer defining him. He had learned the hard way that life, no matter how painful, moves forward. And so did he. As for April, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, her political ambitions in ruins, and the bitter reality of her actions hanging over her like a dark cloud. She had lost the man she had once claimed to love, and now she was left with nothing but the consequences of her choices. In the end, the story of John and April was a tale of betrayal, power, and the painful reality that no one can escape the consequences of their actions. For John, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had learned the value of self-respect, and that was something no one could take away from him. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this.